History 1. 4 years ago, I decided to rent an Airbnb for the holidays. I was visiting my family for the Christmas week, so I picked a place just a few miles away from their home. When I arrived on December 20th, everything seemed just as I'd imagined. The house was ordinary, nestled in a regular neighborhood, and overall I was pleased with my choice. I got there around 6 p.m. that first day, but I didn't feel like going out to see anyone until I'd had a good night's rest. So I stayed in and relaxed for the evening, watching some TV and even getting a bit of work done. I went to bed just before 10 p.m. and quickly fell asleep. In the middle of the night, however, I was slowly awakened by a noise coming from downstairs. Half asleep, I didn't bother checking the time. The sound was like a few small thumps against the wall from somewhere in the house. Listening to the noises, I didn't feel worried. I just thought it was the house settling. I drifted back to sleep and don't recall waking up again that night. By morning, I'd forgotten about the noises. I figured it was probably just the heating unit or something. I let my family know I had arrived in town, and we made plans for dinner at their place. I spent the entire morning and afternoon relaxing at the Airbnb until it was time to head out. Grabbing my bag and keys, I walked up to the front door to leave. When I opened it, I was startled to find a man standing right there on the porch. It completely caught me off guard. I stood there for a second just staring at him before finally asking, "Can I help you?" The man didn't knock or ring the doorbell, which made me wonder how long he had been standing there and why. He didn't respond to my question but simply nodded and then walked away. I watched him go down to the sidewalk and continue down the street until he was out of sight. It was undeniably strange and creepy. Why was he at the Airbnb? How long had he been standing there? I made sure the place was locked up tight before heading to my parents' house for dinner. During dinner, I shared the odd encounter with my family, and everyone agreed it was creepy. Despite that, we had a nice meal and plenty of other great conversations, catching up on life. But the whole night, I couldn't shake the thought of that man and whether my belongings at the Airbnb were safe. I left my parents' place around 9 p.m. and got back to the Airbnb 15 minutes later. I parked in the driveway, walked up to the front door, and looked around for any signs that someone had been there while I was gone. Seeing nothing unusual, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. I walked down the hallway into the kitchen, dropping my keys and bag on the counter. Suddenly, there was a thump, the same as the ones I'd heard the previous night, but louder now that I was downstairs. It clearly came from one side of the house. I cautiously stepped into the room near where the sound originated, but then I heard another thump from a door right next to me. Jumping back, I felt a surge of adrenaline. After staring at the door for a few seconds, I heard the faint sound of heavy breathing from the other side. Panicking, I grabbed my keys and ran for my car. I didn't know what was happening, but I wasn't about to stay and find out alone. I called 911 and waited for the police to arrive. When they did, I watched them go in and search the house. After a few minutes, they came out and told me something horrifying. The person was behind the garage door, which showed signs of distress from someone trying to break the lock. Unknown to me, there was a side door connected to the garage that led outside, which had been left unlocked by whoever stayed here before me. I never planned to use the garage, so I never checked it. Whether the man on the porch was the same person in the garage, I still don't know. But knowing someone was right below me, trying to break in while I slept, was terrifying. What they intended to do after breaking in, we can only guess. After that, I moved to a hotel for the rest of the week. Even now, 4 years later, I still find myself thinking about that unsettling situation. History 2. A few weeks ago, I went on a trip and rented an Airbnb townhouse. I was staying in a small town near some trails I wanted to hike. I'd never been there before and didn't know much about the place. I just knew it was a small town conveniently located for my plans. The drive took about 9 hours, so by the time I got to the Airbnb, it was pretty late. The street had several other townhouses on it, but once I found mine, I parked on the road and took my things up to the door. The place looked decent enough from the outside, not too new or fancy, but nothing unexpected. I texted the owner to let them know I had arrived since I couldn't find the door passcode in my emails. I waited for a few minutes, standing there and looking out at the street. Then I heard a door open nearby, and a man walked around the corner with a smile on his face. He introduced himself as the Airbnb host, let me in, and said he'd be right next door if I needed anything. I wasn't expecting that, but he left quickly and didn't make things awkward. I set up my things in the bedroom, looked around the house, and then went to bed soon after. The next day I ate a quick breakfast, then drove out to a trail and hiked for about 4 hours. I got back to the townhouse around 7 o'clock in the evening. When I entered, something felt off. Some things in my room seemed slightly moved. Nothing was missing, but I had a feeling that someone had been there. After looking around for about 30 minutes, I decided it was just me being nervous about staying in a new place. I forgot about it, heated up a frozen meal, and ate dinner on the couch while watching YouTube on my phone. At 11 p.m., I went to bed. This was a single-story townhouse, so the bedroom was at the end of the main hallway opposite the front door. I was used to sleeping upstairs, so it was a bit hard to get comfortable. As I lay in bed trying to sleep, I kept falling asleep for a few minutes, then waking up and repeating this process. Then, maybe an hour into the night, I was lying there awake, waiting to fall asleep again, when I heard something from outside the room. A door softly creaking open from across the house. It sounded intentional, like someone was trying to open it quietly. I sat up in bed and looked at the door, listening. After a minute, I got up and cracked the bedroom door open just enough to see down the hallway. I could see the dim glow of the porch light, indicating that the front door was partially open. I carefully and quietly closed my door and locked it, then moved to the back of the room and quietly called the police. In the middle of the call, I heard a creak right outside the bedroom door. When I looked at the bottom of the door, I could see the shadow of someone standing there. I immediately stopped talking, waiting for them to walk away before continuing to report to the operator. Thankfully, nothing else happened as I waited for the officer to arrive. By the time they got there, whoever it was had left, but there were shoe prints all over the place, showing someone had indeed been inside. While I was convinced it was the Airbnb host, the cops didn't find anything to support that other than the front door being open without any sign of forced entry. There's also no way to know if they had been inside while I was gone during the day. With nothing missing and them coming back only once I was there, I think their intentions were focused on me. It still haunts me, wondering what could have happened and if they're still out there trying to find their next victim. History 3. Last New Year's, me and my 2 best friends decided it would be fun to get together and rent out a house for the night. We weren't big on going to huge parties, but just enjoyed hanging out among our small group. Also, all of us lived in dorm rooms, so having a house to ourselves for once sounded like a great time even without partying. My friend Mike rented out an Airbnb on the outskirts of town. I carpooled with my other friend Sam, and we met Mike there on New Year's Eve around noon. This place was more of a cabin than a normal house, being all wood and having the typical cabin features. There were other similar-looking cabins around, but they all had decent spacing between them, so it kind of felt like we were out there alone. The inside wasn't as great, but this was one of the cheaper places available, so none of us were expecting luxury. We spent the day just hanging out in the living room and talking, and around 6, Sam went out to the store to grab some snacks and drinks. During this time, Mike and I were still sitting in the living room when there was a knock at the door. We looked at each other in surprise, knowing it was really weird for anyone to be out here and knocking on the door to an Airbnb. I got up and looked out the peephole, seeing some guy standing on the doorstep. I noticed the door had one of those metal latches on it, so I flipped it over and opened the door just enough to see him. I wouldn't usually answer the door to a random guy, but being in someone else's house, I wasn't sure if maybe it was the host or something. The guy looked at me, and I was instantly aware of his displeased look. He seemed angry about something, and it became more blunt when he opened his mouth. He told me in a disrespectful and stubborn tone that we needed to be quiet tonight and not disturb the entire neighborhood. The way he said it was almost threatening and as if we'd already been making noise, but we hadn't even done anything loud, nor were we planning to. All the houses were so far apart that even if he was a neighbor, there was no possible way he'd hear anything unless we were lighting up fireworks or something. I really wasn't in the mood to argue, so I just said sure, and closed the door in his face. But not even a second later, he banged on the door again. I ignored him that time, making a face at Mike like this guy was crazy. We heard him leave after a moment, and when Sam got back, we told him about the encounter, and he almost didn't even believe us. The next 3 hours went by quickly as we watched a movie and played some games on Mike's Switch. Then, come almost midnight, we heard something outside. It sounded like someone dropping something on the ground, and a few seconds later, the piercing sound of glass shattering came from right outside the door. All of us stood up and ran to look out the window, seeing that same guy from earlier standing by Sam's car, which now had glass covering it from his shattered windshield. The guy was holding a metal baseball bat and looked like he was in some psychotic state, pacing around and just going crazy. Sam was pissed, going to the door and storming outside to confront him. Both Mike and I went to stop him, but before we even got to the doorway, a gunshot echoed through the cabin. I stopped in place, knowing what had likely happened, but it almost felt like a miracle when I saw Sam sprint back inside and lock the door behind him. A few more shots went off, hitting the side of the cabin and followed by the man swinging the bat against the front door. Then, just as suddenly as it all started, the man just ran away. After an investigation, it was found that he wasn't even one of the neighbors of the Airbnb. Nobody seems to know who he was, where he lived, or even why he went absolutely insane. It was just an incredibly dangerous, unpredictable encounter that almost took our lives.